Welcome to Manitowoc History Review. Today we are going to be exploring Manitowoc Evergreen Cemetery. We are standing before the main entrance of Evergreen Cemetery, located off Northeast 18th Street in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. For those not familiar with Manitowoc, we are a city of around 35,000 citizens. We are located on Lake Michigan and about 35 miles south of Green Bay and 80 miles north of Milwaukee. The sign we are looking at was placed here in 1985. It is granite and measured 10 feet by 4 feet. Some of the more interesting facts about Evergreen Cemetery are: since the cemetery was established in 1852, there have been over 29,000 burials. To identify these burials here, there are over 17,000 markers or tombstones. The cemetery is heavily wooded with over 1,100 trees, and to keep the trees and grass healthy, the cemetery has 350 water spigots. At the present time, there are 3.5 miles of paved roads within the cemetery. To say the least, there are a number of vintage buildings and many important and fascinating individuals buried within the cemetery, which we intend to explore during this and future episodes. Because of the cemetery's incredible history, it is my intention to divide the cemetery tours into 3 parts, as I'm sure no one wants to watch 3 hours of cemetery history in one setting. So here we go. Sit back and enjoy. One of the landmarks of the city of Manitowoc is the Sexton House, located on southeast corner of Evergreen Cemetery. While the property for Evergreen Cemetery was purchased in 1852, families that buried their dead in the cemetery were pretty much on their own. There was no sexton to dig the graves, so they had to dig the graves themselves or hire someone to do it. They also had to maintain the grave if they wished it to look respectable. This would be the case until the year 1870, when the city hired its first sexton, a man named John LeCorn. He would serve in that position for the next 18 years. The position of sexton did not actually become official until 1878, when a city ordinance was passed creating the office of city sexton. It described the duties of sexton as such: to maintain and safeguard the cemetery property, to accurately record each burial with the individual's name, date of burial, and location within the cemetery, to sell plots within the cemetery for current and future burials, to have graves ready for burial on the day of the funeral, and to supervise workers in cutting grass and general maintenance. What also changed in 1878 was that the city felt the sexton needed to live on the cemetery grounds to better keep an eye on the cemetery both day and night. To accomplish this, the city appropriated $700 for a combination house and office. The original structure was 22 feet by 30 feet and constructed of cream brick, which were manufactured locally. Once the building was complete, Sexton LeCorn and his wife Anna moved in. LeCorn was born in Bavaria in 1809. He came to America In 1854, and settled in Manitowoc that same year. A skilled shoe and boot maker, he opened a store on Washington Street. In addition to running his business part-time, he took the duties of the first sexton of Evergreen Cemetery in 1864. He would remain sexton until retiring in 1890 at the age of 81. The next sexton was Gustav Fraze. Because Fraze was married with children, the small sexton house was inadequate for a family. The city stepped forward in 1893 and added a two-story south wing, which was 22 feet by 18 feet. Gustav Fraze served as sexton until 1900, when the next sexton, Emil Schrader, moved into the house. He brought with him an even larger family. Once again, the city added onto the structure, this time a one-story north wing, 20 feet by 16 feet, which included a porch which was covered. This brought the all-brick structure to 2,464 square feet. The dwelling now included a spacious office for maintaining records and doing the business of the cemetery. The residence itself included a kitchen, pantry, dining room, living room, basement, with the upstairs featuring 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. To say the least, the building was more than adequate for a normal-sized family. The dwelling, although owned by the city, was considered part of the sexton's compensation package, which included $300 per year in salary in the year 1890. The next to live in the house and supervise cemetery activities was Edward Passwalk, who served from 1912 to 1951, a remarkable 39 years. He was followed by Louis Nortman, who would serve as sexton for 32 years. When Nortman retired in 1983, he became the last sexton to live in the sexton house. The position of sexton was eliminated, and control of the cemetery evolved into a system of managers, and under them a cemetery foreman or team leader. The sexton house would remain vacant for the next 5 years. Then in 1988, after needed repairs were completed, the building became the home of the Manitowoc County Historical Society. They would occupy the building until moving to a new location in 1996. After their departure, the building would remain vacant for the next 5 years. Around 2001, the Dram Corporation offered to make badly needed repairs to the roof, interior, and exterior of the building, if they could occupy the building to use as offices and meeting rooms. Since that time, the building has been maintained by the Dram Corporation. Also, in 2001, the building that served as the residence for all 5 sextons was added to the National and State Register of Historic Places, as one can see by the bronze plaque located on the north side of the building. We are now looking at the rear of the sexton house. 2 other important buildings that stood next to the sexton house were the barn and outhouse, also called the privy. One could argue which was of more importance. The barn, of course, was for the family horse or horses, and a storage area for a wagon or buggy. We must remember that there were no motor vehicles in common use in the 1870s and into the early 1900s. For the sexton and his family living in what was considered the west edge of Manitowoc, a horse and wagon were essential equipment for obtaining supplies for his family and items needed to maintain the cemetery. With that in mind, a barn was needed for his horse and a place to store his wagon or buggy. Also during that time, there was no other storage facility for equipment for the cemetery. For those living in the Sexton house, they considered the front of the house to be facing east on North A Street. North 18th Street would be the road directly to our east with the heavy vehicle traffic, so that made the back of the house facing west. It would make the most logical location for the barn to the rear of the house, which we are now looking at, and probably close to the main entrance of the cemetery. We have no idea how long the barn stood at that location. It would have ceased being used as a horse barn once the Sextons were able to obtain a motor vehicle, but probably continued to be used for storage of cemetery equipment for many years. The other building of great importance was the family outhouse or privy. The most logical for this facility would have been to the back of the house and rear of the barn. The family outhouse was a very private matter, and it's doubtful if those visiting the cemetery were invited to use the facility. Since we do not have a picture of the Sexton's outhouse, we can only guess if the family had what was referred to as a one-holer or a two-holer. One thing we must remember about outhouses is that they do fill up and need to be emptied almost on a yearly basis, if not more, for a large family. You may ask who would want to get into the pit of an outhouse and empty it with a shovel. But yes, there were men that did that for a living. They were called nightmen or night soil removers or gong farmers. One such man was John Freilich, a German-born immigrant who settled in Manitowoc in 1856. In April 1890, he emptied the Sexton outhouse and charged the city $2 for his service. The following year, he again charged $2 to empty the same privy. When we consider there were hundreds of homes in Manitowoc at the time, Mr. Freilich probably made a very good living at his trade. Emptying the outhouse pit was not as easy as it sounds. First, the outhouse had to be moved so the worker could get into the pit. Then the contents of the pit were placed into a bucket and then into a wagon. Once emptied, the outhouse was moved back to its original location. The contents of the pit were then hauled away to a specific location. Even using the outhouse was a duty one never forgot. Who would want to get up in the middle of a cold winter night when the temperature was a minus 20 degrees, then light an oil lamp so you could see your way, and then trudge outside into a foot of fresh snow? Sit down on a frozen board to do what needed to be done. This is where the use of the chamber pot came into play. The pot could be used at night and emptied into the outhouse the following morning. I'm sure the Sexton families would have had more than one chamber pot ready for use during those times. The outhouse at Evergreen would have been abandoned shortly after city sewers were extended to the area of the cemetery, sometime in the 1920s or 1930s. When it was actually taken down and the pit filled in is anybody's guess. We are looking at the grave and burial place of Judge Jeremiah Hall Woodman Colby, who has the distinction of being the first burial in Evergreen Cemetery on May 11, 1853. Judge Colby was a very prominent individual in the small village of Manitowoc. Born in New Hampshire, On January 14, 1821, the son of Benjamin Colby and Polly Woodman, as a young man he attended Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, graduating in the class of 1842. After college, Mr. Colby studied law and became an attorney. By 1850, Colby had moved to Manitowoc, where he became the village's first practicing attorney. What brought him to Manitowoc was probably the relatively inexpensive land in the county, as the Colby family owned a vast area of 2,500 acres. Around 1852, Colby was elected county judge, the first ever to hold that office, and had married Emily Jones, the daughter of Benjamin Jones. Benjamin Jones has always been considered the founder and father of Manitowoc. Things were going well for Colby, his wife Emily, and their young son Gilbert, until 1853, when Judge Colby was stricken with tuberculosis. The disease quickly took its toll, and Colby passed away on May 11, 1853. Although Manitowoc was not a large village at the time, almost everyone in the community turned out to escort the remains of Judge Colby to his final resting place at Evergreen Cemetery. Thus, he became the first burial in the new cemetery. A stone monument was placed over his grave and stood there for many years until it finally became unreadable and then toppled over. It remained lying on the ground until a prominent citizen in Manitowoc stepped forward and had the stone re-engraved and placed back in its proper location. This is the stone we are viewing today. Alas, we now tell the sad story of Sergeant Meade Holmes, Jr., son of the Presbyterian minister from Manitowoc. Sergeant Holmes was born on October 27, 1841, in Ohio, the only son of the Reverend Meade and Mary Holmes. He came with his family to Manitowoc when his father took over as pastor of the Presbyterian Church. It was in Manitowoc that Meade grew to adulthood. But unfortunately, during the process, Meade contracted rheumatic fever, which severely damaged his heart. From that time on, he was a very sickly child. Meade was well liked by his friends and the community in general. He took on the same characteristics as his father, always willing to lend a hand when he was able. When the Civil War broke out, Meade desired to join the first company of men forming for the war, but was talked out of it by his parents because of his health. Each time a new company was raised in Manitowoc, Meade honored his parents' request to stay at home. Finally, on August 22, 1862, he could wait no longer. Meade enlisted as a private in company of 21st Wisconsin Volunteers. Over the next 9 months, Meade would participate in the battles of Perryville, Kentucky, and Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and would be promoted from private to corporal and then to sergeant. In addition to his soldier duties, he had taken over the duties as company clerk. Ironically, in the spring of 1862, Meade's father had decided to offer his services to the government as a chaplain to one of the Wisconsin regiments. A short time later, he received word that he would be taking over the duties of chaplain for the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry, then stationed in Helena, Arkansas. On his way to Helena, he planned to visit his son at Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where they had been camped for the winter. On April 13, 1862, the Reverend Holmes walked into the camp of the 21st Wisconsin and inquired of his son, Meade Holmes. He was introduced to the chaplain of the 21st, who sadly informed him that Meade was no longer with them, that he had passed away just the day before. He was told that the day before his son had finished his work as company clerk and had gone to the campfire where he poured himself a cup of coffee. He was standing and talking with a couple of his fellow soldiers when his heart suddenly stopped. He fell to the ground and died within seconds. There was nothing they could do to bring him back. To say the least, the Reverend Holmes was heartbroken. He had lost his only son. The following day, Reverend Holmes started for Manitowoc with the body of his son. Travel in the 1860s was difficult at best, and by the time he reached Manitowoc, word of Sergeant Holmes' death had already reached the community. His memorial service was held at the Presbyterian Church and conducted by the Reverend I.W. Healy of Milwaukee. The church was filled with members of the church, the community, and soldiers on leave. After the service, Meade's body was taken to Evergreen Cemetery, accompanied by a large processional. He was laid to rest, one of the first soldiers from the community to give his life for his country. Some of the first burials in Evergreen Cemetery were those of Civil War soldiers who had given their lives for their country. With that in mind, we now look at the night battle of Rappahannock Station, Virginia. Night battles during the American Civil War were extremely rare, but one such battle did occur on the evening of November 7, 1863, when Union forces managed to pin a large force of Confederates with their backs to the Rappahannock River. It had taken them the better part of the afternoon for Union forces to assemble a large enough force to make an attack successful. During their wait, they were under constant shelling from Confederate cannon dug into the earthworks they were about to attack. The shelling took a heavy toll on Union forces, and when the order to finally charge came, they were more than willing to move forward. They now had to cover nearly 3/4 of a mile while still under heavy fire from Confederate cannon and musket fire from Confederate skirmishers. Two of the Union regiments in the lead were the 6th Maine, and close on their heels was the 5th Wisconsin Infantry. By the time they reached the Confederate fortification, the field behind them was littered with the dead and wounded, and the darkness of the night had fallen on the battlefield. Undaunted by the darkness, Union forces began pushing the Confederates out of their first line of fortifications. One of the lead companies into the entrenchments was Company A of the 5th Wisconsin, led by its young and fearless captain, Horace Walker. Walker had led the company through the first 2 years of the war and many battles, being wounded twice during that time. Walker was born in May 1838 at Homer, Cortland County, New York. When about 20 years of age, he settled in Manitowoc, where his older brother, Charles Walker, was a practicing attorney. Under his brother, Horace studied law and was admitted to the bar around 1860. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Walker joined Company A, where he was named the company's first lieutenant. Within months, he was moved up to the position of captain. On that dark night in 1863, Walker, at the head of his company, was one of the first into the Confederate entrenchments. Close at his side was his young sergeant, Joseph Goodwin. Goodwin was born in Michigan in 1841 and settled in Manitowoc County with his family when yet a young child. He too enlisted in Company A in April 1861 with his older brother, Wilson Goodwin. Within a year, Joseph had become one of the company's sergeants. Now, directly in front of Captain Walker was a loaded Confederate cannon that had been abandoned by its gun crew. Walker immediately ordered Goodwin and several other men from his company to turn the cannon down the trench works to a group of Confederates still holding out. It all happened within seconds. As Walker pointed his swords towards the Confederates, a musket ball fired by one of the Confederates entered Walker's head, killing him instantly. Before he even hit the ground, a second Confederate musket ball ripped into Sergeant Goodwin's body and passed directly through his heart, also killing him instantly. The fight continued into the darkness until the remaining Confederates surrendered or tried to escape by swimming the Rappahannock River. The following morning, the bodies of Captain Walker and Sergeant Goodwin were found lying side by side in the Confederate entrenchments where they had fallen. The Union forces had suffered greatly, with 419 of its members killed in action, but Confederate numbers were far worse. 2,093 of their men were killed, wounded, or captured. The 5th Wisconsin had their 4 senior captains killed in action, along with many of its men. Several days later, First Lieutenant Wilson Goodwin took over command of Company A. He was given permission to return to Manitowoc with the bodies of his brother Joseph and that of Captain Horace Walker. After a large funeral in which many of the residents of the village and county attended, both Walker and Goodwin were laid to rest here in Evergreen Cemetery. Another interesting story to come out of the Evergreen Cemetery is the button factory. In 1891, a button factory was established in part of what would become Evergreen Cemetery. They made buttons which are still occasionally found on the cemetery grounds. The button factory in Manitowoc is an interesting story. The factory was started in 1891 by Ferdinand Hayroth on 10 acres of land adjacent to the cemetery. Hayroth was born in Michigan, Wisconsin in 1856 and came to Manitowoc as a young man. He worked at several jobs until he saw an opportunity to start his own business. The button factory itself sat in a group of trees directly in front of us. He purchased 10 acres of land on Manitowoc's north side, erected a building, and obtained the needed machinery to start producing buttons. But they were not wooden buttons as one might expect. These buttons were made from clamshells. Now, clamshell buttons have been around for hundreds of years, but the cost of having clams shells shipped to the Midwest from coastal waters was extremely expensive. Then in the 1880s, it was discovered that clams from inland waters were far better suited for button manufacturing than ocean clams. Waterways such as the Mississippi and Missouri rivers would furnish an unlimited source of clams for button making. After being removed from the rivers, the clams were broiled and the meat removed. The empty shells were then sent off to button manufacturers. At the factory in Manitowoc, machines punched out the rounded buttons, usually about 3/8 of an inch in size. From larger clams, as many as 6 buttons could be obtained. Once removed from the shell, the 2 holes were drilled in each button for attaching to clothing. As many as 5,000 buttons could be produced each day. Now, as with any manufacturing industry, a problem can develop, and it did with the button factory. Once the buttons were removed from the shell, it left the remaining shell with no intended purpose. The discarded shells were placed in large piles behind the factory, and once the shellfish began to deteriorate, they produced a strong odor. Such was the case with the discarded clamshells behind the factory. Neighbors began to complain about the odor. This may be why the factory did not last long. We don't know the exact date the factory closed, but by 1910 Hayworth had sold the property and was living in Duluth, Minnesota. In the 1920s, the city of Manitowoc purchased the 10 acres for expansion of Evergreen Cemetery. Today, that area where the button factory once sat is surrounded by tall spruce trees. No graves have been placed in this area as yet. If one looks really carefully, you can still find small fragments of clamshells that were discarded well over 130 years ago. Continuing with our study of Civil War soldiers, we are now standing before the grave of First Lieutenant Nicholas Romer. Peter Nicholas Romer was born in 1825 in Hanover, Germany. He immigrated to America in 1846 and came to Manitowoc in 1852, where he worked as an attorney and banker. At age of 31, he married fellow German Pauline Heinemann, and over the next 6 years the couple had 2 children. When the Civil War broke out, Romer offered his services to the newly formed 26th Wisconsin Infantry and was made the regiment's sergeant major. He would serve in that capacity until being promoted to second lieutenant and then first lieutenant of Company C. Romer would see action in the battles of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and Kennesaw Mountain. In April 1864, while engaged in the siege of Atlanta, Lieutenant Romer was shot in the head by a Confederate minie-ball. It is unknown if the ball actually entered his skull, but it did severely fracture the bone of the skull's right side. Romer was taken to the Division Hospital and then on to the General Hospital in Chattanooga, and 3 days later to the Officers' Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. Lieutenant Romer would linger on in the Nashville hospital for the next 3 months and finally succumbed to his wounds on July 20th, 1864. His body was returned to Manitowoc on the vessel Comet on September 2nd. It is unknown who ordered his body returned or who paid the very large expense to have it brought here. Certainly not his young widow with 2 small children. My guess is the citizens of Manitowoc provided the money for the return of one of their own. As fate would have it, Company A of the 5th Wisconsin Infantry and Company B of the 9th Wisconsin Infantry had just returned to Manitowoc from the war. Their service time expired. The 2 companies constituted the escort of Lieutenant Wilmer's body from the Wilmer home in downtown Manitowoc to Evergreen Cemetery. Marching at arms revered, they kept time to the mournful music of the fife and drum, by this giving Lieutenant Wilmer a military burial. After the war, Mrs. Wilmer applied for and received a small widow's pension. She received the pension until she remarried in 1869. Just a side note on this story, when Mrs. Wilmer remarried in 1869, she married Gottlieb Billings. They remained married until 1889. Mr. Billings was a beloved music teacher in the city of Manitowoc, and his loss was largely felt by the Manitowoc community. She had her second husband buried just to the right of Lieutenant Wilmer in basically the same plot. She herself is buried to his left in a small grave that you see straight ahead of you. After the death of her second husband, Mrs. Billings would move to Milwaukee, where she passed away in 1915. Her body was returned to Manitowoc and buried along with her first and second husbands. GAR Burial Area. By 1870, the cemetery was in need of additional space for burials. There being little development around the area of the cemetery, the city was able to purchase an additional 43 acres for $3,000. Included in that new purchased land would be the future GAR burial area. We are now standing next to that area. For those unfamiliar with the GAR, it stands for Grand Army of the Republic. It was the first veterans organization in the United States. Established in 1866, it was made up of honorably discharged Union Civil War veterans. It did not include Confederate veterans, as they had their own organization, the UCV, or United Confederate Veterans. There are literally thousands of Grand Army of the Republic posts throughout the United States, even in the Deep South. Each post was usually named after a local Union soldier that had died in battle during the Civil War or a famous Civil War general. Manitowoc Post 18 was named after Horace M. Walker, captain of Company A, 5th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry, who was killed in battle on November 7, 1863, in Virginia. The area we are in was acquired by the local GAR post in 1888. It was not purchased. It was given to them by the city of Manitowoc for a specific purpose. That purpose was the burial of indigent Civil War veterans. In other words, burial of veterans who could not afford a proper burial after their passing. Fortunately, of the 2,600 men from Manitowoc County that served during the Civil War, only 10 veterans needed that service. These 10 veterans were buried in a row in the northwest section of the lot, with the belief that more would be needed later. Once again, fortunately, that was not the case, and when the last Civil War veteran from the county passed away in 1933, it left the majority of the large lot unoccupied. The area then became a popular burial location for veterans from other wars and peacetime service. It took nearly 125 years, but as one can see, the area is now almost completely filled with the remains of veterans that faithfully served their country. The GAR monument in the center of the lot was placed here in 1934 after the passing of Frank Brown, the last member of GAR Post 18. After his passing, Post 18 ceased to exist. The monument was purchased and installed with the monies remaining in the GAR treasury. The monument was designed by the ladies of the GAR, the wives and daughters of the Post. The monument was dedicated on Memorial Day, May 29, 1934, in a very large citywide ceremony that saw thousands of city and county residents in attendance. It was a final tribute to all the men from Manitowoc County that faithfully served their country during the American Civil War. The flagpole next to the monument is not original. The original pole was placed there by the GAR around 1889. It proudly flew the American flag for the next 120 years. But by 2009, it had become seriously deteriorated and needed replacement. That same year, the Manitowoc County Civil War Roundtable stepped forward and purchased a new 25-foot flagpole. After maintenance staff from Evergreen Cemetery removed the old flagpole, members of the Civil War Roundtable arrived with the new pole and placed it in the ground where the old one had sat. The new pole included lighting so the American flag could be flown both day and night. The Civil War Roundtable has taken on the responsibility of making sure an undamaged American flag is always flown above the graves of these honored veterans. The veterans area in the cemetery was used by the City of Manitowoc for the annual Memorial Day ceremony until the 1950s, when the crowd of spectators became so large that complaints were received about people standing or walking over graves in the area to see the program. The ceremony was then moved to North 18th Street in front of Evergreen Cemetery. The GAR area in Evergreen Cemetery is still a work in process. Between 2021 and 2024, the Manitowoc County Civil War Roundtable had installed 5 beautiful ivory silk Japanese lilac trees that now surround the GAR area. These trees will grow to 25 feet in height. It is a small flowering tree with cherry-like bark and bears large, fragrant, creamy white flowers that bloom in early July. When these trees are fully grown, they will add a new beauty to an already beautiful area. Also, in 2025, the Manitowoc County Civil War Roundtable replaced 9 of the 10 original gravestones that had become unreadable over the years and the 4 corner markers that surround the GAR area. One of these markers has been placed in each of the 4 corners of the GAR lot. James Cumberledge. James Cumberledge is another fascinating subject of the American Civil War. He was born in the state of New York in 1834. When the Civil War broke out, Cumberledge enlisted on April 28, 1861 in the New York Independent Cavalry. He would serve with distinction until discharge. Cumberledge, his wife Catherine, and one child continued to live in New York until 1874 when the family moved to Manitowoc, where the couple added 2 more children to their family. Unfortunately, before long, 2 of these 3 children passed away. As can be seen, the 2 children are buried directly behind James' military stone. In 1881, Cumberledge helped organize Horace Walker Post 18 Grand Army of the Republic in Manitowoc. In 1884, Cumberledge would serve as commander of the local GAR post. In 1886, the Wisconsin Department of the Grand Army of the Republic decided they needed to establish a veterans home to supplement the veterans home in Milwaukee. The veterans home in Milwaukee was becoming crowded, and some of the rules were not to the liking of the veterans who were now beginning to age. That year, 1886, the GAR chose 5 of its members to find an appropriate location for such a home. One of these 5 men was James Cumberledge of Manitowoc. For the next year, these 5 men traveled around the state of Wisconsin looking for such a location. After careful deliberation, they settled on an area that had been a resort in Wapaka County. The new 42-acre facility would become known as the Wisconsin Veterans Home. In later years, the name was changed to King Veterans Home when the newly formed Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs took over the property. In honor of the 5 men that selected the location for the Veterans Home, a street was named after each of them. Today, those from Manitowoc can proudly travel on Cumberledge Lane in King Veterans Home, Wapaka County, Wisconsin. James Cumberledge passed away on March 24, 1919, and is buried in Evergreen Cemetery with his wife and 2 children. To all my viewers, I would like to thank you for being with me for part 1 of a tour of Evergreen Cemetery. I will shortly be posting part 2. In part 2, we will be seeing and hearing about the history of Evergreen Cemetery Chapel, which was built in 1917 and still stands today, the Manitowoc City Hospital, and the 9 private homes that once stood inside the cemetery. The interesting story of several soldiers from World War I and World War II that gave their lives and were brought home to be buried in Evergreen Cemetery, and the history of several notable men and women that helped establish Manitowoc in what it is today. See you next episode.